thank you for joining us this morning. I am Cynthia Johnson, and I am so excited and delighted to have Gerald Griffin join us this morning for his presentation, An Artist's Story, The Paradigm Shift. So just to give you a little background about the format of today's session, we'll run for an hour. The first 30 minutes or so is an interview that includes a video about Gerald and his work. And then following the video, you will have an opportunity to ask Gerald questions directly. So you can put your questions in the chat. I'll be monitoring that. Or you can raise your hand and hopefully we'll be able to get to everyone's questions. So I am going to ask Jim to just say a word or two about an upcoming program that Rocky's going to do.
Oh, right. Today we're starting a new pastor-led discussion of the Bible. Rocky Suppinger is going to join us and talk about the books of John 1, 2, and 3, which he's calling love letters. So Rocky's always got a good perspective on things, so I hope you can all join in at 12:30 on a Zoom. We have Rocky and then Nanette 3 weeks from now for our last Foundations of Faith classes.
Okay, thanks, Jim.
Yep.
And if you would, Jim, please go ahead and launch the video.
Okay.
Good morning and welcome. My name is Cynthia Johnson, and I am a member of the 4th Presbyterian Adult Education Committee. Today and next Sunday, the committee is delighted to feature Gerald Griffin, gallery owner, painter, sculptor, and poet laureate. Gerald has an amazing capacity for creating art that is not only imaginative, but expressive. His capabilities have special sensitivity to his mediums. He is a visionary who has produced some very provocative contemporary art pieces. Gerald is a graduate of the Art Institute in Chicago. He has exhibited in major venues throughout the country, and he's received many awards for his work. Many of our viewers are familiar with The Ascension, the painting that was commissioned by the Fourth Church Racial Equity Council in 2019. Gerald not only produced that piece of art, but he also created a poem to accompany the piece of art. But what you may not know is that in addition to being a prolific artist, Mr. Griffin is a successful business person and the founder of An Artist's Life, a 501c3 nonprofit educational foundation that focuses on connecting economic, racial, and social divisions by providing under-resourced youth with the keys to self-sufficiency. He does that through paid employment in the areas of art and design fields, and we'll hear more about that nonprofit entity in next week's presentation. Today, we're going to focus on exploring Gerald's body of work called The Paradigm Shift, An Artist's Story. You can put your questions, if you have them, in the chat box, and I will be monitoring the chat, and Gerald will get to as many questions as possible at the conclusion of today's presentation. Thank you again for joining us. Sir Gerald, thank you for being with us today. We're very excited about today's session and next Sunday's session as well.
Thank you for having me.
So my first question has to do with kind of a historical perspective, if you will. Many African American artists have captured images of the Great Migration that took place between 1915 and 1970, when more than 6 million Black Americans fled from the South to the North and to the Western cities in our country. Gerald, you've created an amazing series of work called The Paradigm Shift, An Artist's Story, which you will be speaking to us about today. But before we begin that conversation, I'm curious to know if any of the artists like Jacob Lawrence or Charles White or Elizabeth Catlett, who also created bodies of work about the migration series, did any of them influence the way you approach this project?
I think that those particular artists did, as well as so many other artists and musicians and newscasters and stories and narratives that I'm exposed to. When I was at the Art Institute and taking art history classes, I learned about artists like Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci from the Renaissance period, and the French Impressionists, Monet and Cézanne and those different artists, on up to modernism, where you learn about artists like Andy Warhol and Picasso and on and on. And there weren't very many black artists that was part of that narrative, part of that story. I think the one black artist who I learned about when I was in college was Henry O. Tanner. And just, very small tidbits, Tanner was gained prominence after the Impressionists because he was an American artist, but he worked in an Impressionist style. So after I graduated from the Art Institute of Chicago and went out and started, presenting my portfolio and trying to get in different galleries and art fairs and shows, I worked part-time. I had two part-time jobs. First part-time job was at a bank handing out flyers. And Chicago winters made that a very short job. The second job was working at a framing shop. And this framing shop was on the south side of Chicago, in Hyde Park, actually, Artworks Gallery. And at this gallery, I learned about all of these different artists that were part of the WPA period, Works Progress Administration, who hired all these different artists. And I learned about all the artists who were part of the Southside Community Arts Center, the Charles Whites and Elizabeth Catlets and Gordon Parks and all these different artists who were creating these works, who were kind of left out of the narrative of American artists. And many of their stories resonated with me because the work that they created spoke to historical events within the Black community, within the Black story, within our cultural narrative that is rarely spoken of. And I guess to some extent, that had a lasting impression on me in the work that I was doing and wanting to be able to also add to that story and add to those narratives and kind of superimpose those within some of the works that I was creating. The Paradigm Shift series was slightly influenced by them, but it was more influenced by current events and current opinions and perceptions that people have around race, identity, humanity, and how we fit together as a human family. Sometimes in competing, volatile ways, sometimes in ways that's cohesive, and often within the same event. You could be with a group of people at a concert or a basketball game, and everybody's just all cheering for the same thing. And that same group of people could be presented with a police shooting of a young Black man, and then their opinions are as varied as the ocean is from the sky. So it's that dynamic of opinions and ideas that made me want to explore this paradigm shift. Essentially thinking about looking at a situation, you see it from your perspective. A bus crash, the person across the street sees it from his perspective. I see it from my perspective. In my opinion, it was the blue car that caused the crash. In their opinion, it was the red car that caused the crash. And we both are right, because if I was standing over there, it's the red car. If they were standing over here, it's the blue car. But we don't see the whole picture. So how do we shift our paradigm? How do we shift our perspective so that we have more of a full story where the truth lies, where the balance lies in so much of our interactions?
The paradigm shift is based on the concept of African Americans who are often viewed from a historical perspective about slavery. Your narrative in this series is focused on shifting that paradigm in exploring modern-day African American people and how they fit into the human family. Share the background with us about what inspired you and led you to create this body of work, and what message you hope to deliver in the narrative.
Well, so much of the history of African Americans that we are accustomed to is from the perspective of slavery. And even the whole idea of slavery being something that is connected to the history of Black people, where, in my opinion, the history of Black people should be the history of the struggle against slavery. Slavery is actually the history of white people who created an economic system that was based on slavery. The history of Black people is the struggle to survive within the slave system and the struggle to fight against the slave system once the system of slavery was over with. You're fighting against Jim Crow, you're fighting against unequal rights and those kind of things, civil rights, trying to gain a balance and trying to gain yourself, your tradition, your wholeness again. So the Paradigm Shift series kind of tries to explore this idea of the struggle, the idea that this historical narrative is only one part of an experience that we've had as a group of people, that slavery doesn't identify you in terms of who you are as a person, because it's such a small part of a person's experience. If you were to imagine how it would fit in a person's day, maybe that's 2 hours out of the 24 hours of their day. Maybe that's 2 hours out of the lifetime of their cultural existence. Although it's 400 years, our history goes back many thousands of years to antiquity. Within that time frame, there's so many levels of success and forms of society that we've assumed that to today be defined around this one epic within our history, I think is kind of a tragedy.
You have said that the current racial environment and unrest in our country has exposed lingering problems in our society about racial identity, and that it's uncovered wounds that have never been healed in the past. Unpack that for us. Tell us what you mean by that.
When you have a wound, there are certain ways that you can address it. You know, if you have a sickness, there are certain ways that you can address it. You can cover it up, or you can try to cure it. If you try to cure it, you try to take the cure, then whatever the sickness is gone, and you can move on. If you try to cover it up, if you just, I'm gonna wear this so it doesn't show, I'm gonna, put this cream on. When you take that jacket off, it's still there. The lingering effects of chattel slavery and oppression continue to permeate within society because they've never been addressed from a vantage point of trying to cure that wrong. Chattel slavery was taking people and separating them from their family members, separating them from their culture, separating them from their language, separating them from their humanity and who they were. The end of slavery, Emancipation Proclamation, was taking the physical chains off of people, but the mental and psychological chains that were also applied during that process are the chains that are never addressed. So that continues to permeate within the society, not only for Black people, but for white people as well. But we all kind of grow up with this elephant in the room that we don't address. And every now and then something will happen. The elephant will step on a table and break it, and everybody has to look over there, and it's like, oh my God, there's an elephant in the room. Let's put him in the bathroom so that we can continue to have our party until the elephant comes out of the room again and, kicks over something else, and we're still dealing with this, as opposed to just dealing with the elephant in the room. So the paradigm shift, in a way, I'm attempting to challenge us to address some of these lingering ghosts that continue to haunt us as a society.
Do you think having these conversations will help lead us to greater understanding?
I think they will, because, like in that bus analogy I gave, our perception is more about right and wrong. Our perceptions are oftentimes limited. I did a painting that's part of this series that is called The White Horse. And in the painting, you have this migration of individuals, some out in the cotton fields, all the way up to the foreground where there's a little baby in the cotton field with a sack on his back. There's this large white horse. His eye is the center of the composition, and on his back is this little black kid that's tied to the horse. And it speaks about this idea of the identity of black people being tied to the identity of white people. In terms of, you say, well, this is a great doctor, and this is a great black doctor. This is, it's always this prefix when you're talking about black. There's always this prefix when you're talking about African people. You say African Americans, but if a guy's Italian, I don't say Italian American. If he's Jewish, I don't say Jewish American. I just say Jewish, Italian, African American, which ties back to this idea of why is there a other, why is there a difference. But in that story, in that painting with the white horse, it also pays homage to white people who took part in history that isn't told as well. We every year we go through Black History Month, and we're taught the history of black people's struggle against slavery and oppression. We learn about Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, Harriet Tubman, on and on. We learn the story about Harriet Tubman and her efforts to go back to the South and, through the Underground Railroad, help to free, you mentioned the migration, to take blacks to the North to freedom. And along the route, they would hide in the forest, or they would hide under a barn, or they would hide under a porch. But those barns and porches belonged to white people who were abolitionists or who were anti-slavery advocates who risked their lives and their families to help Harriet Tubman bring this group of black people to the North to freedom. So when we are taught this story of Harriet Tubman, it's Harriet Tubman against the white people, as opposed to there's this whole group of people that was against this system of oppression. We don't get that story. White kids don't get that story. Black kids don't get that story. There's a missing narrative. There's a missing paradigm. You get the red story, the red car, I get the story of the blue car. Nobody gets the full story of what happened. So it's easy for us to be at odds. It's easier for us to say, I'm the hero, you're the villain, I'm the hero, when we don't get the full narrative. And there are people in society who take advantage of those varied opinions about who's right and who's wrong, and they use them to their benefit. They prosper when people are at each other's throats. And with this series of paintings, body of work, I'm attempting to have a conversation about that full story and that full narrative. And I think that story, or those stories, those narratives will help us to to be able to come together once we understand.
What would you like people to take away from your presentation today about the conversation around the paradigm shift narrative?
What I would like people to take away is the idea that they've only heard part of the story. They've only experienced part of the story. The recent racial unrest and the recent destruction of historical monuments has to do with that idea. That here's a statue of Christopher Columbus that is romanticized and shows him as this great founder of the United States, of America. But they don't tell the story of Christopher Columbus being someone who committed genocide. Or there's a statue of Thomas Jefferson, regal president, but it doesn't tell the story of Sally Hemings, who was Thomas Jefferson's slave, who he had kids with, who remained in slavery, although they were his kids. So there's a feeling of anger at those different monuments or Confederate monuments because they tell a romanticized one-sided story, and that there's another side of the story and narrative that isn't told. And there's a resistance of the larger society to take down those monuments because there's a misunderstanding as, well, why is that so offensive? This is, on and on. Because they haven't heard the other side of the narrative either. They haven't heard the full story. Their paradigm hasn't been shifted. Our paradigm hasn't been shifted as a society, which helps to change things. And, with these series and with these bodies of work, I'm hoping to spark those conversations.
And we're going to hear more about the Monument Series next week, next Sunday. So I thank you very much for framing today's conversation about the paradigm shift and taking us deeper into some of the inspiration and insight that you had as an artist to create this body of work. And before we go on to the next part of the program, there's a video that you've produced on the Paradigm Shift series. So let's take a look at the video.
Okay.
And then we'll come back to you.
All right, sounds good.
Thank you.
I began this series maybe 3.5 years ago. It's an extension of earlier work that I was creating, a series that I called Ambiguous Reflections, A Question of Color. And in this particular body of work, all the paintings and sculptures were based on poems, different poems that I had written, things that were currently in my mind, I was contemplating. Most of the works are social commentary that is from the perspective of an African American, me being African American. The works consist of 25 paintings, 5 sculptures, and about 15 poems. And the title Paradigm Shift comes from this idea that as a collective, African Americans are often viewed from a historical standpoint of slavery going forward, especially the history that is taught in the school system. And this series is an attempt to recognize that, but also to move beyond that and to shift the paradigm and our vision of ourselves from one of victim to that of victor, from one of dependent to that of independent. And the idea that those chains, whether they be physical, mental, or spiritual, are within our power to break and drop. These ideas are explored in many different forms in my work. As I mentioned, there are 5 sculptures. So there's a 3-dimensional form. There are 25 paintings that range in size from 11 by 14 inches up to 9 feet by 14 feet. And scale is dependent upon the amount of information and the seriousness of the piece. I guess I've always been an artist, although I never imagined that this is what I would be doing for vocation. It was something that was buried inside of me, and I guess it was my fate for that to come out. And I'm glad that it did, because it helped me to create a way of expression and conversation and dialogue that I don't think exists in any other form. usually begin each piece with an idea in mind, an inner vision, I would say. And from there, I work on the composition, be it a painting, I work out the colors, a sculpture. I begin working on the armature and thinking about how I can bring this piece into life. I'll begin an oil painting first and foremost by stretching the canvas, deciding which colors I'm going to use, mixing the colors, working out the composition, and then the piece will develop. This particular painting that I'm working on is titled Escape, and it's using a historical narrative of a slave escaping from a slave ship as a metaphor, the desire of modern day African Americans and people of color to escape the lingering effects of chattel slavery, which are racial oppression and inequality. So I thought it important to create a piece that would spark a conversation visually about these ideas, because we still grapple with them as a society. In the particular painting, you'll see on the right side, you'll see Africa, and on the left side, you'll see a modern day city skyline. And the poem to this piece speaks about the atrocities of the past. However, the last stanza says, "But today I will remember me, today I will escape." And it's the idea of escaping that past and escaping that history and recreating ourselves from within. This piece, The Power of Love, speaks to how the power of love and family is what it takes to break chains. And that family goes beyond race or ethnicity. That family is about the human family. And that family coming together is what it's going to take to break those chains. For example, when we think of the Underground Railroad, when we think of the iconic Harriet Tubman and her heroic efforts to help enslaved Africans escape, but we often forget that those Africans were hidden in people's barns and under porches by white people who felt just as impassioned about slavery and felt that it was wrong, and they risked their lives and their families to help and aid Harriet Tubman in helping Africans to freedom. So we have to realize that Black history is all of our history. We were not isolated in time, and we aren't isolated in time today. We are all one family. My hope is that these works will inspire us to shift our vision and our paradigm about the reality of who we are as a people, our importance, and how we fit into the human family.
I hope you enjoyed Gerald's presentation and the very compelling video that he produced on the Paradigm Shift series. And as he mentioned, one of his inspirations for creating the work is to spark conversation. So we'll have some time now to have a conversation between the group. Gerald will take questions from you. I see that Michelle has mentioned in the chat that it was a very powerful presentation, and I would agree with that. So I'm going to open it up to questions. You can either raise your hand or put your question in the chat box. And let's take full advantage of having the artists with us to answer your questions this morning. So while you're thinking about your questions, and I know you have them, so give it some thought and share your questions with the rest of the attendees today. But while you're thinking about your questions, I'm going to ask Gerald to talk about one of the paintings that was very prominent during the interview that I conducted with him. It's the Ali painting, Muhammad Ali. And we had a short segment where Gerald talked about that, but unfortunately, we weren't able to include that in this morning's presentation. So Gerald, if you would chat with us about the Ali painting and tell us about the background for that, how you met him and how you ended up creating that piece of work.
So yeah, wow, time flies. It's been years, but I met Muhammad Ali many years ago, and him and his wife. And what was most impressive to me about Muhammad Ali, beyond just him being a great fighter and personality, was his principles, was his dedication to humanity, his dedication to trying to fight for equal rights and justice for people of color. And this painting that I created is called Ali Freedom Fighter, and it's a rendition of a young Ali in his prime, and with a cocky look, and he's kind of looking back over his shoulder. And on the left side of the composition, there are trees symbolic of the South, and on the right side of the composition, there are skyscrapers, urban skyscrapers, symbolic of the North, and this idea of migration. And in the tree, in a section, and that direction that Muhammad Ali is looking over his shoulder, and it speaks to this idea that beyond just being a talented fighter, he was a person who had great morals, and he was very dedicated to working against oppression and the freedom of Black people. And he gave up his career. He said he wouldn't go to Vietnam and kill people. There were Black people being killed in America that he was fighting for. So he wouldn't go over there and kill people for America when this was going on, when his atrocities were happening right in his backyard. And he gave up his career. They took his boxing title away. He, was threatened with going to prison. He never knew if he would be able to fight again. And if you can imagine someone who worked their entire life to accomplish themselves, and then they reach the pinnacle, they're the world champion, and they just say, okay, I'm giving it all away, all the money, all the fame, whatever, and I'm willing to go to prison because I feel that strongly about the injustices. And that's what made, that's the reason why we're talking about Muhammad Ali now, as opposed to the countless other boxers who became world champions, because that one thing set him apart, where his actions shifted a paradigm. It shifted a paradigm so much where he transcended boxing and became this iconic figure. And in that way, I'm inspired by his story, and that's the kind of story I'm trying to relate and have within this series, this body of work.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that, because that's such an interesting piece of art. You can almost feel his presence as if he were in the room, the way he's looking. We have a question from Jim. Did your original portfolio contain all subjects or only Black historical events? And what mediums do you start with?
Okay, so my original portfolio, if you actually go back to my original portfolio from my time at the Art Institute of Chicago, all of my subject matter were, white models. It wasn't really Black subject matter. It wasn't really this kind of historical narrative. My first major gallery exhibition, solo gallery, was long before I ever had a gallery, was at a gallery called Philly Gallery, which was in the River North. And it was a series of landscape paintings. It was a series of iconic spaces around Chicago, the bridge at Michigan Avenue in Balboa, or Grant Park, or, all these different iconic neighborhoods in Chicago. I did this whole series of paintings called the Urban Landscape Series. And I think there were about maybe 15, 20 paintings, various sizes. And that entire body of work sold out. It was a sold out show. I was ecstatic. And the gallery director was ecstatic. And, we talked about going hard at work for the next year for a new show, a new exhibition called Urban Landscapes 2. So I started going around different areas of the city, doing compositional sketches and getting ideas, what's going to be included, what isn't, in Urban Landscapes 2. And I came to this area in the financial district, the Board of Trade, City National Bank, Federal Reserve Bank. And it's kind of this little cul-de-sac that ends with the Board of Trade standing tall and regal at the end. So I was like, yeah, great, this is it. I went down there on a Sunday morning and set up my easel, because it's a ghost town. So I'm in the middle of the street with my easel, doing a compositional sketch. And this idea just hit me. And I imagined that if I broke open the ground, I wouldn't see steel beam and concrete holding up this. I would see Black men and women. And so I quickly sketched it out, and I went home and I worked on the composition. And I did this painting called The Foundation. And in this painting, it's the iconic space. Ground is broken open and you see all these people holding up the structure. And I was excited. I showed it to the gallery director at the time, and she was like, that's great, but where's the landscapes? And so I finished the Urban Landscape 2, but that conflict, that friction with this new idea is really what kind of sparked me to want to have my own gallery. And that painting was later entered into 2 art competitions. It won first place at Museum of Science and Industry Black Creativity. It was included in a group show called Black Romanticism in New York at the Studio Museum. Eventually, the piece was sold, but it kind of shifted. It was a turning point. It shifted my perspective to this idea of social commentary within art, because it spoke to this idea that Black people have played such a significant role, not only for 400 years of free labor in creating the wealth of the United States, but also many of the traditions and many of the things we take for granted, science, math, architecture, all these things have their roots in African history going back to antiquity. Rome was influenced by it. Greece was influenced by it. All of these different societies were influenced by Africa, Ethiopia, Timbuktu, all these different things. And that rich history isn't told. And many Black people feel apprehensive about being in this financial district as if they don't belong. But this painting spoke to this idea that you're the foundation on which this is built. You should feel it's your birthright to have a seat on the Board of Trade. You should feel that you should be inclusive in whatever is going on, because you're part of the foundation on which it stands. And that's the idea behind this. It's the idea of shifting our paradigm about who we are and how we fit into the American story. So that painting kind of sparked a different series of paintings on to the paradigm shift and the historical monument series that I'm working on currently. I know it's a little long for an answer, but.
Very interesting, very, very interesting. We have a question from Laura. How do your ideas take shape in a particular medium? say, poetry, painting, and sculpture?
Okay. So with the Paradigm Shift series, I think it came out to about maybe 35, 40 pieces. When I did that video, I said there were 5 sculptures, there are 7 sculptures now that are part of that series. And they all began as poems. I wrote this, so before I pursued art as my livelihood, back in high school, and I was into music. I was into writing, playing piano, writing music, writing songs, and writing poetry. And I had all these different poems that I had written. I have all these poems that I've written, probably 100 of them. And someone was saying, you should publish this. You should put it in a book. These are really good, really interesting poems. And I decided to take about 30 of them and do visual interpretations of those poems, and then have that be a body of work, which is what Paradigm Shift is. So each painting or sculpture began as a poem, and then that painting or that sculpture is a visual representation of that poem. So so the poems came first, and once I would go back and read the poem again and really think about it and try to imagine what this would look like visually. In some pieces, it's a painting. It's a painting of like the Opulence poem. The painting that resulted from that is a painting called Tiana 2, where it's a parody of the iconic Breakfast at Tiffany's, but it's a young Black girl, because there's a whole history back in the 1920s, 30s, 50s. There's a whole history of upward mobility amongst African people, Black people. There was Bronzeville in Chicago. There was Tulsa, Oklahoma. There were all of these different communities that were successful and burgeoning. And that history is often not told when we're thinking about history. So this piece, this poem, Opulence, came from that idea. And the reason I'm looking down, I'm trying to pull the poem up so I can share it with you guys. So I thought that what would be a really good interpretation of this poem, and Breakfast at Tiffany's is what came to mind. My daughter, my wife, and so many Black women really love that story, and really love Audrey Hepburn and her style, and this whole idea of that upward mobility. And so that's how she became the subject of that poem. Okay, so the poem for Opulence says, the grandeur of royalty used to belong to you and me. Why is it that we don't ever see my true story in front of me? When family was everything, villages where life would spring, old wise folk would tell the tale of glorious days far beyond the pale. Before chains on our body, before chains on our mind, before this cold and bitter winter, back when the sun was in our eyes, our ancestors were mortalized, our children were our greatest prize. We must never miss the chance to reflect upon our opulence. So Opulence and Tiana 2, there were 2 different paintings. Actually, you can see, if you can see in my gallery background, there's a painting on each side of these 2 women with the big hats and the gowns and their part. That's Opulence 1 and 2. And then Tiana, which you can't see from this perspective, but Tiana 2 is on the other wall. Those 3 paintings all come from this idea in these poems.
Thank you. Thank you so much for explaining the background. And it's good to be reminded of those periods of upward mobility. I think people tend to forget that ever happened. Here's a question from Michelle. How did you discover your artistry, and how old were you?
Okay. So my older brother used to used to draw as a kid. When we were kids. I probably was about 7 years old, and he would draw Batman and that kind of thing, and I wanted to do it too. So I would try to copy his drawings, and it was just a hobby. Nothing I ever expected to be doing in my life. So many artists I talk to say, "Oh, when I was born, I knew I was going to be an artist." Me, just the opposite. As I mentioned earlier, I got into music and grew up on the northwest side of Chicago. So my first year of high school was in Austin High School, and I had a general music class. My grandfather took ill, and he lived and worked in the Pilsen area, which is Hispanic. So we moved, our whole family moved, uprooted, moved to Pilsen. And to me, it was like, this is the worst thing in the world. All of my friends I went to grade school with, and the West Side Black, it was all, it was monolithic. And now it's monolithic, but it's all Hispanic. And so I transferred to Benito Juarez High School. And I was in an English class one day, finished doing my work. And at that time for me, I was, school was, I wasn't that interested because, it wasn't anything there that really compelled me to want to stay. I come in, do my work, and just wait on the bell to ring so I can get out. And this girl sitting behind me, her name was Connie. Her name was Consuelo Casacuaro. And Connie was saying, "Oh my God, you draw really," because I was sketching and, a little piece of paper I was done with my test. And she said, "We need an artist for the school newspaper." And I was like, "I'm not really interested in that." And she said, it's great. We get to write our own stories. Sometimes when we have deadline, we can get out of class because we have to do our stories. And I was like, wait a minute, we can get out of class? So I ended up going with Connie down to the supervisor for the school newspaper. And she was like, "Oh, he can really draw." So she looked at my drawings, like, "These are great. What art classes do you have?" And I said, "I don't have art class. I just have general music." She said, "Oh, we got to change that. We got to change that." So we went to the counselor's office, and they changed my general music to Studio Art 1. My teacher was Miss Unger. And so in Studio Art 1, you get like a general introduction to painting, drawing, ceramic, making bowls and things like that. Watercolors, all the way up to doing a little 8x10 oil painting. And so I was, we were doing oil painting, and she said, "Draw whatever, you can draw whatever you want, just feel free, no pressure." So I did a painting of my hand because I didn't have any, I'll paint my hand. And she saw the painting and was like, "Oh my God, how long have you been painting?" And I was like, "This is the first one." And so Mrs. Unger started entering my work in different contests, and I was winning. And school kind of changed for me. So I was on the newspaper staff, I was on the yearbook staff, I was on the basketball team, I was in the photo club. All of a sudden, I stayed at school after school. It became a place that I wanted to be as a place I didn't want to be. And I ended up winning a scholarship to the Art Institute. And so now I'm here talking to you today. So that's kind of how the art career found me. That story says two things to me. One, it says that your environment has a huge role on your life. So my environment on the West Side may have never presented an opportunity for me to discover my artistic ability in terms of, I knew I could draw a little bit, but it wasn't anything that, that I was really going to explore to that extent. Moving to Pilsen, I thought was the worst thing that could have happened to me, but it was actually the best thing that could have happened to me. So many other kids that I went to high school with had, their lives went tragically because of the environment that they were growing up in. The year before we moved there, which was 1980, 1979, Benito Juarez was just built. It was a brand new school built in the Pilsen neighborhood, named after Benito Juarez. They had tennis, they had, photography class, they had everything at this school, which they had none of that at my high school. So that was a turning point. And I reflect upon it. I think about how lack of exposure and lack of opportunity has such a lingering effect in the lives of so many of our kids.
Gerald, we have about 5 minutes left, so I want to be sure we get to as many questions as we can. I'm going to bundle a couple of questions, and Annette will get to you right after.
Thanks. Thanks.
Bundle a couple of questions, and one dovetails very nicely into the comments you just made. Thank you very much for sharing your perspective. How do we change the historical events dialogue so that these reflect both sides in our classrooms? And then also, what can Fourth Church do to help you move the conversation forward about the paradigm shift? What can we do to support your efforts? So first one is about the classroom.
So the classroom aspect, I think it's really just exposure. Me being exposed to different things changed my perspective. I had a chance to go to Europe, and I went to Giverny, I went to Monet's house, I went to Versailles, I went to, I was in Paris, I was in Venice, I was in different parts of Europe. I walked inside of a church from the 12th century. It changes your perspective about how vast history is, how big the world is, and how small our differences can become when we look at the bigger picture. The exposure to different narratives, to different stories, changes our perceptions about ourselves and about others. And I think a lot of that is missing from the curriculum in schools. The way that we do it, the way that we change that, I think, is with putting art in public places, having these different narratives and stories in other places. The painting that the church commissioned for me, the Ascension piece, it has a different representation of what the Ascension could be. And that painting will spark questions. And that question will spark dialogue and conversation. And I think more of that is important. Right now, I'm hard at work on a series of maquettes that I hope to become large monumental sculptures that's going to be in public spaces. And these are sculptures that try to address the fact that I mentioned earlier that Christopher Columbus and Thomas Jefferson and the parts of the narratives of the stories that aren't told, and those different stories that we never grow up and learn about. Daniel Hale Williams, who was a Black doctor who did the first open heart surgery. There was no such procedures for open heart surgery. He just made it up. Those stories are important for Black kids to learn about, for white kids, for all people to learn about. His sculpture should be somewhere. A sculpture of Jean-Baptiste Dusabo should be somewhere, who, was one of the founders of Chicago. And he's a small little bust on the bridge that everyone overlooks. But there should be a huge monument in a park somewhere to kind of balance out these narratives and let people know that our history is much more rich and much more varied than just this one small slice of history. And it changes our paradigm about who we are and what we do. So, the last question, for me, the greatest thing Fourth Press could do, like for any artist, is support that artist. Commission me to do another piece, commission me to do a sculpture somewhere, share the work, spread the information, and have some tours, come to the space. I'd love to see you guys, as COVID changes, and we could kind of have these conversations. And it's almost like seeing a long lost relative after a long time, and you're telling stories and you're catching up and you're learning new things. I think we need more of that, and that changes our perception of each other.
Thank you for that. And I'm sure once COVID changes, we'll have an opportunity to visit your space. And next week, we'll see more of Gerald's. We'll see video footage of Gerald's amazing gallery space and showroom. So we'll see more of that next week. Annette, you had a question.
Yes, I have a statement and a question. First of all, when you cut out the arts in the public schools, you're doing everyone a terrible disservice. And I taught all kinds of arts in the public schools. And the second thing I want to ask is this question about political art. This seems to be a big deal. Obviously, your piece of Paradigm Shift is politically based as well as humanly based. But when people ask you, are you a political artist? How do you answer that? Do you say, I am an artist, period? I am an artist who specializes in? How do you do that?
You know, I have a painting in this series that is called Opposites Attract. And it is a huge field. There's a black man who's like this, and there's a woman, a white woman, who's sitting on an American flag, and she has a bouquet of flowers to her chest. And in the background, there's a lynching. It's political in that it talks about this idea of being murdered because of who you love, but it's also a piece about our humanity and the insanity of that idea. So I think all art is political. Even if it's a sunrise, it's political to somebody. So I don't think that you can really separate it.
Okay.
Some is a little more, in your face and a little more, and then some is subtly political. There's a painting in the background you guys can see. It's the title of that piece is White House. And there's a little small image of Obama standing in front of this huge, massive structure. The painting is about the iconic White House. It's about the place where Birth of a Nation was shown on the White House lawn. And that started the Ku Klux Klan. It started this whole terrorist organization. On the shadows in the front here, those are shadows of Klansmen with pointy hoods. And it speaks to that history, that lingering history in an institution that should be sacred. In an institution like the White House that you would think is about liberty and is about equality and how we've gone past that and we've grown. But right after the Obama presidency, we had the Trump presidency, which spoke to this idea that those different spirits still continue to haunt that building and this country. So it's a subtle piece, but it speaks to it speaks to that elephant in the room that I mentioned before. And I think art should do that. It should challenge us to look at the reality of the life that we're living and the situations that we're living. Years later, 100 years later, when I'm not here, someone will be able to look at that painting and say, oh, that was when America had Barack Obama as the president and they were still haunted, So it's all monochromatic. It's all black and white. The only color is the back of Obama's neck. Even the flag is black and white because it speaks to this idea of trying to reduce everything to black and white, which is what this idea of racism did. But there's too much, we're too varied as people. There's too much color in the world to reduce everything black and white. So we have to realize that, and art hopefully helps us to look at those things.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
That's a great note to close on. The bad news is our time together has ended. The good news is Gerald will be back next Sunday at 9:30 to continue the conversation. And next week, he will be talking about his Monument series, which is really, really an exciting series of work that he's producing. I'm going to close with a comment that Lucy put in the chat because I think it's a perfect close for today's session. We're so grateful to God for your gift and also feel so blessed by your contribution both to Fourth and to the world. Gerald, thank you so much for sharing your time and your talents with us today. We can't wait to see you again next Sunday. Thanks for joining, everyone.